just wanted to talk to you about that.
Don't be nervous. It's just...
I'm not nervous.
Okay. So, like, we sent you out that list of questions,
Right.
and, it was just super broad stuff.
Right.
But, like, what specifically does creativity mean to you in your life?
Okay, well, I think when I got those questions, I wasn't sure how to respond, so they were kind of off the top of my head and kind of fast. But to me, oftentimes people think of creativity, as you mentioned in what you were saying just now, as something limited, like to the arts or certain kinds of professions and whatnot. We tend to think of music and painting or crafts and things like that. But to me, creativity is an attitude you have in your life that involves a passion for what you're doing, that involves sometimes thinking out of the box, because we all live in boxes of various kinds. It's difficult to escape those boxes entirely, but I think regardless of what kind of life we're leading, what kind of job we have, what kind of setting we're in, there are always opportunities to break through the confines of that setting and to think outside of the box, like Dr. Kimball does.
What box?
So I think it involves passion, thinking out of the box, and almost a kind of rebellious attitude toward the system and confines that you find yourself in. And then, of course, possessing certain skills or outlets that enable you to see that creativity take some sort of form.
Yeah.
In my case, in teaching or writing, and that kind of thing.
I had a story I was saying before, like, our paper is based on how creativity is found through not only arts, but leisure, work, and education. So, obviously, your work is, your anthropological studies, but it's also education. So how do you embrace creativity, either through your studies or through your teaching job?
Okay. Well, in my research, my anthropology, the stuff that I've written and published, is really out of the box. When I first did my research in Mexico, I became kind of disillusioned with anthropology and its tendency to objectify people and turn them into case studies or examples, and like the thing I talked about in class. Those were real people, right? And they were people who have the same sort of passions and conflicts and struggles that we all have as being human, to try to figure out what life is all about, why we're here, where we're going, how long do we have, those kinds of things. And what do we do with ourselves, and how do we meet the challenges that we have in whatever cultural or physical context we're in. And so when I was first doing my prolonged field research, I felt that the anthropology that I wanted to do was to try to humanize the people who I got to know. And first of all in Mexico, later here in Appalachia, and then in India, which are the three kind of cultural contexts that I've lived and worked in. And so when I write, when I produce anthropology for consumption out there, I try to simply tell stories and to let people's lives, as I understand them, of course, speak for themselves. I don't try to write in complicated terminology or use, concepts that only anthropologists can understand. I try to write in a vein that makes anthropology accessible to all humans, no matter what their educational level is, no matter what their interests are. And so my anthropology, in terms of my research and writing, has really been out of the box. And I've even been accused, when you write stuff, it sometimes gets reviewed by people. And So I've been accused of not doing anthropology, of doing something else, but not anthropology. And actually that pleases me because that means I'm out of the box in anthropology. So in that way, I'm constantly trying to find different ways of writing. For example, when I did research here with the homeless population in Boone, I volunteered for 3 years at the hospitality house. And I simply hung out with people and got to know them and got to hear their stories of how they arrived at their homelessness. And instead of writing an academic paper, I simply wrote a paper which allowed them to speak in their own voice. So I tape recorded a lot of stories, and I edited those tape recordings to make them have a kind of consistent narrative component so that a reader could logically follow them. But they were in their voices, and so I just let them speak for themselves. I didn't analyze it, I didn't interpret it. I didn't say this is what it means, this is what causes homelessness. I simply wanted those voices to be heard. And that's kind of unusual. And my teaching, I struggle within a system here, and that system isn't always a pleasant one. And classes have gotten bigger and bigger. The class you're taking, is a big class. And I try to handle that by not just standing up in front, but I try to walk around. I try to walk up and down the aisles. I try to introduce a little bit of humanness, but still communicate material. In my smaller classes, I operate very differently than in your class. For example, I'm teaching a seminar called the U.S. Cultural Derangement now, in which we're looking at kind of what's happening in this country politically and religiously and economically, trying to figure it all out. And it has 16 students. And we just basically sit around and talk. Whether there's the reading assignments, students keep journals, and there's a series of short papers. There are no exams. And there's a final paper in which they're going to try to creatively put together what they think they've learned from the class. But basically, it's an opportunity for us to sit down and read certain material that we're sharing and converse about it and learn from one another. And that's my preferred way of teaching. But again, our classes here at ASU, especially over the last 5 years, have become bigger and bigger and bigger because of the economic situation in the state. We haven't added new faculty, but we've increased enrollment every year. So we're teaching more and more students with fewer and fewer positions. So, I try to operate a little bit differently within a system which is often difficult to operate differently. So I realize a big class often feels kind of dehumanized and impersonal, but it's a struggle to make it, any other way. I told my derangement class that, that's the topic of the class, and that the whole class is going to be deranged. I mean, meaning that, we're just reading stuff and there's no logical development of that material. We're just going from one book to this article to that article. And we're going to negotiate grades. I mean, at the end of the semester, I'm going to sit down with each person and say, what do you think you deserve in this class? And tell me why. And we'll talk about it. And, I'll listen and I'll have input too. And the class has been marvelous. The attendance is super good. Everybody's there, almost every class. They've done the reading. They write beautiful journals. It's just been a really positive experience to see students responding to that without a gun pointed at their head all the time about a grade.
I've noticed that about small classes, that people seem to be more attentive.
Sure. It makes all the sense in the world, and a lot of educational research shows that, But here we have these big gen ed classes that, I'm sure there are more creative ways I could operate in that class, but, I try to.
Well, our teacher, David, was telling us yesterday about, like, he read over our draft of the paper so far.
Uh-huh.
And he was saying that in order to be truly creative with something, you have to be knowledged in the discipline scientific part of it, where, like, you cannot get creative with dance if you don't know how to dance. Like, if you have not been trained in piano, you can't exactly get creative with composing piano music. So how would you say that process works in your life?
Well, I basically agree with David. I mean, I think what creativity is, you have to. I mean, it's like Einstein's general theory of relativity. He came up with that E equals mc squared, and there was no empirical proof of that at the time he came up with it. It was an idea he had, which broke out of a box of a previous kind of physics. But there, it was out there. It was just out there. There was no scientific experimental validation of that idea. But that doesn't mean that any of us could have come up with that idea. He had a full background, although it was a very unorthodox background in physics and mathematics. And so, and when he was asked how he came up with that, he said, I can't tell you, there's only the way of intuition. But it's an intuition which not everybody could have. Okay, so in that way I agree with David that, you can be creative as a car mechanic, but if you don't know the basic tools and knowledge of how an automobile operates, you're not going to be creative at it. So certainly it's there. But that doesn't explain creativity.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have that knowledge without being creative.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of physicists and mathematicians had the same knowledge Einstein had. And Einstein, in some ways, was a failure educationally. I mean, a relative failure educationally. But those same physicists and mathematicians didn't come up with that idea. Right? So there is something, I think, attitudinal about creativity. There are skills. I mean, I don't know that I could produce the kind of anthropology I do in the classroom or elsewhere without having a grounding in anthropology. Although I think a lot of people who have similar grounding, that is, go through PhD programs, are not creative. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I said, I think in my response to you, that I felt creativity could not be taught. It could be learned. And that's a distinction I would make. In other words, it can't be taught to just anybody. But it can be learned by exposing yourself to circumstances and an environment which give you those skills, but also give you other kinds of insight into whatever it is you're trying to do with your life. And so it goes beyond teaching in some kind of, it's not a mechanical thing, in other words. You can take all the dance you want. You can, get a master's or PhD in dance, and that doesn't guarantee creativity.
Yeah.
Well, as for leisure, what do you do outside of your work that you would consider creative, or that you think other people would consider creative? It can be anything. Like, we talked to Cindy Ludkus, and when she goes on her research, she takes photographs.
Like photography,
And she likes to cook.
Yeah.
Just anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, in a typical way of thinking about creativity, I write poetry. And that poetry actually enters into my anthropological writing. My book on Mexico, for example, each chapter begins with a poem that I wrote in the field, which I think in one way or another relates to the narrative chapter that I wrote. The paper I just presented at the American Anthropological Association had it was an academic paper, but it had 3 interludes, what I called interludes in the paper. And they involved narrative storytelling and poetry, which were embedded in, a more academic paper. So those things actually enter into my work, and but also I write poetry, and I've published some fiction actually, because I like to take my experiences as an anthropologist or as just a human being and fictionalize those. But usually, there's some sort of cultural context for that fiction. So I've written fiction. I haven't published poetry other than in books or articles, but as separate pieces I have not. I play the clarinet and saxophone, and I started doing that as a kid. And at one point, I thought I was going to be a musician. When I was a teenager, I loved music, and I loved the clarinet, and I loved the saxophone. But when I got to college, those finally they went by the wayside. But I still have a clarinet, saxophone, and I play the drums. I played them with my girls growing up. We have a whole room full of percussion instruments, and my daughters and I would just bang away. And I still get together with friends and play drums sometime. This may not sound like creative leisure time, but I also, even at my age, play basketball regularly. And there's a real creativity. I play with a group of faculty and staff. There's a game in the Student Recreation Center every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so I go when I can. And it's really interesting because there's a core of people who have been playing with each other for a long time. So we know each other. We know what we can and can't do. We know what we're good at. We know what we're bad at. And there's a real kind of creative flow to that once you're playing with people who you're used to playing with. And I find that to be a big part of my creative life. Although I don't consider myself a jock at all, basketball is something I played since I was little, and I played throughout school, throughout high school, and didn't go further than that. But it's creative also in that it allows me to do something that's physically active. And after it's over, it's like, I have some sort of spiritual renewal. It's really an interesting thing. And I just like to travel a lot. I don't take a lot of photographs when I travel because to me, and this maybe shows my age, but taking photographs, I do. I have photographs all over my house that I've taken in different parts of the world. But I like to be there and experience it, and taking a photograph sometimes gets in the way of that, especially if you're always thinking about, I want to take this photograph. And digital photography now has really expanded that process. We take pictures of everything now because the old way, you had to get a film developed, and it was expensive to buy a roll of film in the first place, so you were more cautious about what you actually photographed. And now it's just my daughters. We go somewhere and they take a zillion photographs. And I say, "Why are you taking all these photographs?"
They keep like
Well,
10.
I can delete them, and it makes sense. So those are some of the things I do, I guess, in my leisure time. I also love to cook. And I can get real creative. I hardly ever follow a recipe.
I wish.
Yeah, I don't.
And I just throw things together, and I like to cook with just what I have available. So I'll open the refrigerator and check it out and just go from there.
That's
So
how my
that's-
parents are.
And I wish I had more time to cook creatively because I really enjoy it. And I enjoy cooking for people who I hope, appreciate what I cook.
Probably. Do you have any more questions?
I think we're good.
Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This was
You're
perfect.
welcome. Well, good luck with your project.
Thank you. We need it.